guest on 3 times
Has
in
it been
1
3
year.
times?
But is it safe to call him a triple threat? We'll find out as we welcome back brother Jonathan Kopel to the Craftsmen Online podcast. Welcome back, brother Jonathan.
Appreciate it. I didn't realize it was 3 times. It feels like it's been forever, honestly. But 3 times is pretty good.
We try to space them out.
Yeah, no, it just feels like so long though.
All right, before we get into this, I'm pretty sure I've already butchered how to pronounce this, and I don't know if there is a right or a wrong way on how to say Sufism. Is it Sufism? Sufism?
I think I probably should maybe do Sufism just because I think that's the correct way of saying it. But I've heard Sufism as well. But I think Sufism is the correct way of saying it.
Okay, and it came on my radar this year. A large part, and why you were here is thanks to you. You asked me, "Hey, do you know anybody that's into Sufism?" And I'm like, "I don't even know what that is." So, tell us a little bit about it and how a guy from Texas discovered Sufism.
Yeah, I would say that to start off with is like I've been always interested in like the mysticism as a part of being a Christian, but I think it was actually learning more from the poetry of the Muslim faith that I think I was introduced to Sufism because most people's introduction is through people like Rumi. Sometimes online you'll see people post Rumi quotes everywhere. But it was actually through that kind of exploration that I was more introduced to Sufism, which is like a broad terminology of a separate kind of subgroup within Islam as a religion. And so oftentimes people will colloquially say, Sufism is like the mystical side of Islam. But it's actually a little bit more complicated than that because Sufis haven't necessarily been always the most peaceful people. It just depends on time and being reactive towards the different trends throughout the history of the Muslim faith from its inception. So that's why it's like a really hard to kind of encapsulate together. There's like whole YouTube videos of people that are like experts in religious studies that actually cover this very topic. But I would say is that the aspects of Sufism that really stood out to me was much more of its mystical and practical elements of what does it mean with the spiritual walk with the creator. And I think that kind of element I thought is something that I thought was interesting is that having a personal relationship was not only encouraged, but when you read their writings, it's very much a wholesome kind of faith where there's no embarrassment about being intimate with God in the walk and the language that they use to describe that. And so for me, not as much being in Texas, but during my time starting to do my physician scientist training, I think that having that kind of intimacy and that honesty, I think was refreshing when dealing with the different ebbs and flows of my life, as well as what I experienced throughout my training, and especially more so now that I'm actually practicing medicine.
Now, do they refer to deity as God, Allah? You mentioned, it's a kind of a branch off of the Muslim
Yeah.
faith. So I'm just curious how they refer to the one, let's say.
Yeah. So I think in general, if you, from a classic Sufi or Sufism perspective, it's more of, since it's from the branch of Islam, it's usually says Allah, but they don't use Allah as a all-encompassing terms. There's the 99 words or 99 descriptions of God that are taught in the Muslim faith. And so really it's more of a placeholder, kind of like in Freemasonry, we have the idea of like the grand architect of the universe. For them, in a lot of cases, it can be that. Of course, if they are Muslim, they can actually call Allah, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, from what I understand.
Okay. And your research into this, or your practice into this, or your study into this, when did you start making connections between some of the core principles of Sufism and how they would relate to what we learn as like Masonic lessons?
That's actually a good question. I don't think it was maybe one particular point. I think it was actually from our discussions, actually, was when we talked about in previous discussions, or like even the third degrees, not talking about anything in the ritual, but like when we talked about the three ruffians, it was interesting about the idea of being able to discover truth that isn't something that is necessarily given within your faith tradition. And what was interesting was that having that discussion, it really made me think about more the contemplative, reflective aspects of faith and being okay with trusting those intuitions and not necessarily being as fearful. And what was interesting was that a lot of Sufism, the one of the main principles is about love and following your heart. There's a lot of language and analogies. And so when we think about the degrees, there's elements of the heart, especially in the second degree, that are mentioned, right? Even in the third degrees, you can even say the first degree, but the idea of the heart, the center of who you are, is something that was being, reflective throughout the entire theology or even belief systems of the Sufism itself. And so when kind of putting it together, it really resonated with me about trying to understand who you are as a person and ultimately your relationship with deity, rather than just necessarily thinking about what it is to be a good person. It's more asking the question like, who are you? That fundamental question of who are you as a person? And I think that was kind of that element of Sufism that I really responded to, was asking that question, but in a way that was approachable, and that it kind of illuminated aspects of the things that we teach within the craft.
Okay. So I'm just going to assume that our listener knows as much about Sufism as I do, which is thimbleful. Thanks to our conversations, I've gotten a little bit more. But if we were to go to Christianity as kind of the base of what most folks in North America would use as they identify somehow to that faith, and that's really creationalism. In the beginning, there was, God was, this, and that. And we learn about how God created us in his image and mankind, and everything from the Old Testament into the New Testament to Revelations. And then you get into Freemasonry, and just having enough, I would say, of like a basic Sunday school education, you'll kind of understand the allegory that comes in Freemasonry of building your symbolic temple. And if you're building a temple, what lives inside of a temple? It's usually God. So why do you go to a temple? It's a place where you can have a conversation or start to make that connection with deity so you can understand some things. When I was new into Masonry, I was inspired, kind of like you, to start researching other traditions and other faiths. And one of them was Islam. And I got a copy of the Quran in English, which is actually a sin to have that, at least in,
Oh
in, the,
yeah,
in the Muslim faith.
if you do that, yeah.
Very upset about that. And it was interesting because within the first couple chapters, for lack of a better term, of the Quran, they reaffirm, I would say, a lot of the things that we learn in the modern, King James Bible. They talk about Jesus. They talk about some of the creationalism story, that it seems like there's parallels to that, of course, with some differences. How does this work for you as someone who's exploring all of this? I'm just curious, like, the picture that you're painting, or maybe if it was like a puzzle, you have the borders of the puzzle in your mind of like that foundation that you had from Sunday school, and now you're starting to fill in all those little tiny squares. Tell us how this is helping to, frame that picture for you.
I think that's actually an excellent question, because of the fact that my introduction to Sufism was actually, I would say, more in tune with the works of Thomas Merton and even the philosopher John O'Donohue. Their works are actually interesting with respect that they come from a Christian tradition, but a lot of their ideas and influences can be, related to things like Buddhism or Sufism, with the idea of the mysticism that they describe. And so from that, it was interesting because exploring their works and in Sufism, it was actually less about the dogma of a particular tradition and asking more about the practice of your faith. In other words, when we talk about the heart, it's more about what is it about your faith that's actually transforming you as a person? What is it that really matters with regards to your relationship with deity? And for me, I thought that was actually the most important thing, because I think we get so hung up with our individual tenets of whatever tradition or with whatever kind of philosophical system we adhere to. I think we overlook the bigger picture. And I think the more that I practice medicine, I see a lot more commonalities in the human condition, in the things that we see in a lot of traditions that people ground themselves with. But from a larger perspective, we can see about how these practices inform our exposure to some of the struggles of being human and being susceptible to a lot of the uncertainties in ourselves, and even when approaching concepts like we discussed about death. And so I think that with Sufism, it more directly addresses that practice, or the way in which you actually approach your relationship with God, that I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, one of the things that you shared with me is that Sufis believe that true knowledge of God comes through direct experience and
Hmm.
not through intellectual study or religious dogma. So they really kind of have that see, observe, be present kind of mentality. Are there any secret teachings or hidden truths that exist in this religion that would really only be revealed to someone who has maybe a spiritual teacher or a mentor? Or is this something that anyone could kind of start practicing and reading on their own?
I think the answer is it can be open to anyone. I don't think there's really like secret teachings because, again, it's the idea of discovering for yourself. One person I met actually described it as, if you want to understand love, I want you to get into a relationship and, break up and actually feel what that feels like rather than have someone tell you what that feels like. I thought that was an interesting analogy because that's what it boils down to. It's saying you actually have to live life. You can't live your faith in this perfect world that you describe within the tradition you adhere. You have to live it in the real world where there are imperfections. Sometimes you won't have all the answers. You can't
Mm,
go to your book and get everything. So the mystery is actually life. It says the biggest mystery is how do you live in life with all these uncertainties, even with your own tradition? How do you actually approach this? Because I think that's the biggest mystery. I think we try and make it very esoteric, like, oh, there's a secret mystery. And I think that resonates with what I see in medicine because if you live life, if you really interact with people and you see what people deal with yourself and the situations you get involved with, there's so much mystery and uncertainty in life that it will teach you those things. Sometimes
mm,
whether you want it or not, or sometimes whether you're expecting it or not. And so I think that's what I really like is that it kind of flips what you said on its head. It says, well, you don't need to look for secrets. You just have to live and trust and to continue being curious and not be afraid of being hurt and not being afraid of trying things. And I think those elements really speak to what we talk about in the lodge about, the way in which we carry ourselves and the manner by which we interact with each other. And even if we do stumble, we're all on the same journey of learning.
mm. We're learning about Sufism with Brother Jonathan Kopel, who's back for his third time on the Craftsman Online podcast. And you opened up the conversation by saying that part of your journey or seek the I guess the truth seeking that you were doing that brought you to Sufism was the story with the three ruffians, which I find interesting because um I'm trying to think of any parallels that would be to that story in the Bible, which you would have more of a stronger basis on. Um, but my point is that I also reached out to other traditions and other practices because of certain things I came across in my
Mhm.
Masonic career. Like, for example, as a fellow craft, when I was going through, there's a part of that obligation where it talks about how he would not defraud another person, how he would come to the aid of others
Right.
and be there. And I really struggled with that because I was like, well, does that mean like every time I see a homeless person that's asking for money or every cause, like, could you imagine every time a telemarketer calls
Right.
your phone? Like, this isn't like Jim Carrey's Yes Man here.
Yeah.
There's this, Masonic gray area. And that's what caused me to go study Buddhism and how Buddha talks about suffering and
Mhm.
how that's a part of our life and understanding that and working to like minimize suffering across the world and saying a prayer for it every morning, but just understanding that suffering is a true element of everyday life. So back to this three ruffians part. I'm interested, did you find an angle to the answer you were seeking by connecting with Sufism? And if so, what was that thought that connected that you didn't already have inside of you?
That's actually a good question. I would say that the main thing that stood out to me when exploring Sufism as a whole, that maybe I hadn't been able to articulate, I think that maybe that's a better way of putting it, is learning to trust and forgive yourself, but also being open to the fact that despite your imperfections, that you can still learn and you can still have truths with your creator that are unique to you because it's a part of what you needed on your own journey and path.
Mm,
And I think that was actually what I thought was helpful because in the writings, they have their own way of describing, different aspects of living and, union and relationship with God. But I think it's the overall tone of the writings. It's not there's a separation between creator and created, saying there's a union and unfolding of life between both the created world and the divine world. And they're not to be separate, but they're both to be related to each other. And I think having that is very helpful when, if you've experienced struggle or other things in life that have been negative, having that level of honesty but intimacy can be very helpful in being able to be open and honest with yourself, and also learning what a good relationship with God looks like. I think sometimes that's something that we don't necessarily see in our traditions because it's very formalized, right? If you're a Catholic, this is the way that you have to approach talking to God. But so much of what we do is talking and so much action that learning to just be receptive is very counterintuitive for like a Western audience, because we're so much told that we need to do things first and then God will respond. Well, if you look at Eastern traditions or mystical traditions, it's more about you just have to chill out. You just have to listen. And that's really hard when we're almost geared to have to be reactive. To do the opposite, it's very difficult. But what I've learned the more I've done this is that it becomes more comforting when you don't have to be always striving to get things or striving to complete things. It actually is very reassuring to just say, I can just sit here and reflect and maybe not even think anything and still hear the voice of God or feel those things that resonate with me. And I think that's something that I find is a nice kind of contrast to kind of like the typical things that we look at with more Western theologies and traditions.
So I want to take our listener behind the curtain here a little bit, because Jonathan and I usually, I think email is kind of your preferred way of communicating, and I'm still a text person.
Yeah, you're a tech person.
So I'll get these pretty beefy emails from Jonathan, a couple paragraphs at least, and it usually leads with a question. And a while ago, the question had to do with the three ruffians and what I thought about this. And then you said, hey, I've been doing a little research into this, and that. I've been reading up on this, and you give me a lot of this perspective. And then I take a step back and I'm like, okay, well, this is a new area of learning for me. And this is what I love about Freemasonry, especially with brothers like you, kind of at this esoteric level, like we feel comfortable sharing, the knowledge that we get. So when it comes to the three ruffians, we're told obviously in our ritual, and we're not going to give any secrets away about who these people are and kind of in the allegory, what they're supposed to represent. Right. And as I've said many times before, I feel so unfortunate for brothers that observe that part of the degree, walk out of the temple or the lodge room and think that's where the learning ends, is right there at that moment, where you're kind of proof where it actually goes beyond that. You've been a master mason for some time, and now you're finally getting to this part of, because it's now relevant in your life. So give me a little overview of that. Like, where were you? Why were you looking into the meaning of the three ruffians? And what is it that you got out of Sufism that everything else in your background really couldn't present an answer to?
So I would actually say it was interesting because I was talking with a few brothers from New York on this very topic, because I'm actually doing the third ruffian of the third degree now. And before this, the term had been used with regards to, trying to seek information that you may not be ready for or fully understand. And for me, it was kind of counterintuitive, because as a doctor, you're supposed to try to find answers. Like, this person either knows something or somebody knows something that can help you answer a question about management or what you don't know. But to say like, hey, you can't just ask this to be given, was counterintuitive. So it took me a while to kind of wrap my mind around that. But when I was talking about the third ruffian with some of the other Masons I knew from New York, one of them actually brought in or discussed the ritual from the way it's done in New York that the third ruffian gives. Oddly enough, DC doesn't do that. So there's a whole part in there that kind of elucidates more of the motive and meaning behind what this particular character is supposed to represent. At the end of it, the major theme is about your integrity as a person. That's really emphasized. And once he said that, I said, oh, that's very interesting, because it goes back to why the idea of character is so emphasized in Freemasonry. Because when you think about it, it's like, why do we have all this stuff on morals? Like, we have to be taught all these things. Like, some of them seem very like obvious. Like, yeah, like you should do that to people. But you really, like, no, really, because like, well,
No,
like, we're adults. Like, we should know how to do this. But then what's interesting is that when we were talking about the third ruffian and then kind of pulling that together with my work as a doctor, I started realizing why it was so emphasized. Because at the end of the day, the one thing that is intangible that people rely on is your integrity as a person. Your word, who you are as a person, speaks louder than anything else that you do. And it's funny because you don't think about that way, but then you realize, like, yeah, like people trust me in my job. Like people learn to trust you very quickly, but it's something you earn. And the way you earn that is by what you actually do and how you carry yourself. The integrity by which your name is backed by what you do as a person. So when we use all these analogies, it really kind of came back to the idea in Sufism about the heart, who you are as a person, how you live your life. How does that relate to the physical and non-physical aspects that we even talk about in the craft? So it started putting together a lot of things without me necessarily having to be an expert at the ritual at every degree of Freemasonry. The one character, by just studying that aspect, opened up a lot more insight. And I think that was a lesson I learned, is that to understand Freemasonry, you don't have to necessarily do every single thing to understand the full picture. Sometimes it's just doing the small areas that you're part of the lodge or that you're learning, and really just taking time to really learn it. And sometimes being patient with the fact that it will take time for it to unfold, but eventually the answer will come. And it's usually when you're not expecting it.
I'm just going to pause and give that some space so that it really resonates with our listener, because I'm with you. Like, I feel like the worst thing you can tell a newly raised brother, or a newly obligated, or even, a newly raised brother, when they ask a question about, oh, hey, what? Well, you should go read this book. I think that's the worst thing that we can tell as Master Masons to new brothers. Why? Because that's not what they're looking for. You can give them some of it and say, you can learn more by reading this book. Here's a resource for you. But just giving them, go read this book, that just turns people off, man. Don't do that. And then I like the other point that you say is that you're not, speaking of books, you don't have to be the best ritualist to really get the most out of Freemasonry. Learn the parts that you can, get involved where you can.
Right.
Because I look at it as like, this is a lifetime obligation that you've taken. You've got a whole life to learn everything about that book. And there's 3 degrees. You're never going to learn every little intricate part of it, because there's always going to be some new area of thought, or somewhere new to explore, or somebody's new opinion. And I like to look at somebody as you as like the perfect example, because looking back, if you could go back to, Brother Jonathan Kopel, just being raised to that sublime degree of Master Mason, you still got that new shiny Mason look about you. How seasoned do you feel you are now versus that time in the past?
I would say, I don't think season's the right word. I think it's more of a realization of kind of like a PhD, how much you didn't know, but it wasn't really knowing. It was, I hadn't experienced or been exposed to. Being raised in Lubbock and then coming to DC, that whole dynamic, coming here was very enlightening. And I think that was part of that realization too, is that when you don't travel, that's the idea. When you don't travel and you aren't exposing yourself, what you see is what you're used to. But if someone doesn't pull you out and put you into different areas, then you'll never know what you don't know, and you'll never know what you're missing. In fact, I think that's one of the great tragedies, is that you'll have Masons that will be really good at the ritual in one area and they really pride themselves. But then what's funny is, again, you go to New York, you go somewhere else, and it's completely different. And then you take a step back, it's like, well, is the point to really master the ritual so much that you can memorize it? Or is it more important that you understand and appreciate the lessons and understand the depth of what's being said, so that it actually impacts who you are? Because the ultimate theme that I've learned from a lot of Masons in the East Coast, especially, is that they care more about who you are and how you apply what's being taught than if you can memorize a few lines. Because I think they've seen too many people that they can memorize the work, but you can tell it hasn't really sunk into their soul and how they lived. And they can't say, well, hey, I knew, Brother Kopel 5 years ago, and who he is now is completely different than what he was when I first knew him. That's what people want to see, is how much you've changed and grown as they've seen you, rather than just knowing information.
Let's get back to Sufism.
Mm.
I'm hoping that our listener, whether they are a Mason at any level or just have a general interest in Freemasonry, by listening to this podcast, you're somewhat familiar with this conversation that we're having, where we talk about the basis of Freemasonry. Our foundation is the building of King Solomon's Temple, which is kind of the allegory of building your own spiritual temple, which is you. You are that temple from the floor up. And we've made that point several times, and I just hope that it connects. And one of the things that you had shared with me before this episode is that Sufis emphasize the importance of spiritual purification, good deeds, and seeking knowledge of God as paths to salvation. And I'm just curious if the building of King Solomon's temple, that symbolic temple that we build in Freemasonry, our quote unquote unique allegory, does the Sufi tradition make any connections or relate to that particular aspect of Freemasonry?
That's actually not only a good question. I think it kind of goes back to like the heart of what kind of stood out to me, because I think the first thing that I would say with regards to like the Sufism is that when it comes to things like spiritual purification, it's really about clearing your mind so you can be receptive to things. So I think, in other words, is that it's less about being perfect, because Sufi, like if you read a lot of the Sufi tradition, you'll read things from Rumi and a few other poets where they're actually very comical. They actually are very good at making fun of each other in a way, and they use it as a way of kind of showing the the imperfections in our spiritual teachers and saying we're just human as much as you are, and probably more lost than you realize. It's
This is
just that
like,
we're much more aware of that imperfection.
I'm just thinking, like, is this like the ancient like Drake and Kendrick Lamar rap battles that were going on
You
back
know,
then?
it was funny because like they would actually, it was funny because there was stories that would be taught about, you know, students would ask one master about another master, and like a lot of what their like wisdom would come from is by self-denigration or denigrating the other person. And that was not done to humiliate, but just to show that you're not meant to hold your mentor up to this pedestal of perfection. They're there to help illuminate what's within you. So, in other words, the self purification is more about teaching you to get rid of all your self notions of perfection, biases, things that get in the way of receiving that which is already out there. And what's out there is usually found in the average day people that we work with. That's usually where I found a lot of the things I've learned is just from a happenstance conversation with one person that I've been with, or just going about my day-to-day routine, the average thing. So I think that's the first part. The other part that really I thought was emphasized was always asking questions and seeking knowledge through things that require you to be more receptive than active. So whether it's meditation, whether it's walking, even just being open to asking questions and even thinking, I've never really asked this before. Like, what does this really mean? I think that's the elements that I see in Sufism that resonate with Freemasonry, because in the craft, we are taught to always seek, ask, and knock. That's part of the first degree. The more that I've gone through the degrees, I realize that's the basis by which you grow. I think the problem is that people get so much into the routine of coming to the lodge that they forget to keep asking questions because they get used to the business of the lodge or doing things. But then no one takes a step back and say, why do we do it this way? Like this seems really bizarre. Like, of all the things we could do, why do we open the lodge this way? Why do we do this? When you lose that sense of curiosity, I think then you get into the trouble of the monotony. There's nothing new. There's nothing. You're actually closing your mind again because you lost that innocence and that sense of curiosity that brought you into Freemasonry to begin with. So to kind of summarize, I would say that the spiritual purification is really just clearing your mind so that you can be open to asking those questions and seeking the knowledge that you need at the particular time in life in the stage that you're at.
I'm thinking the only other person, and I've been doing this for a while, and I'm saying masonry for a while, that I've ever heard mention it was probably our brother and author, Angel Millar. I think he has mentioned Sufism on an episode or in a conversation with me before. But other than that, no one. And what I find so interesting about this, you used a key word as like the mentorship and seeking. And it makes me think of like young people like yourself and why they would be drawn to Sufism or Sufism. Why would this be meaningful to them?
And that's a good question in the sense that Sufism emphasizes that level of intimacy and honesty that people are looking for. In other words, people are not asking for just the run of the mill knowledge that they've heard from every single person. It's really saying life is difficult. You're not going to get good answers. You're not always going to have the answers given to you, up front. It's going to be a struggle at times, but these are the practices and things that help. And sometimes mentorship is a good way of having a mirror, almost like therapy, to talk and say, this is what I'm dealing with. And having someone who's been on that journey and still learning really helps engage two people together. And you gain that knowledge and understanding from someone you can fully reveal your most vulnerable self to. And that, I think, is what people are really looking for, especially in a day where so many things are changing. And the fact that, compared to like 50 years ago in medicine, if you talk to someone about like the immune system, they would only have to know like that much. To know everything about the immune system is like millions upon millions of pages now. It's so much that it would last you more than like a few lifetimes to really even encapsulate. And most of that's going to be wrong. So then the question is like, where do I find myself in the midst of all this change? And how do I adjust properly so that I don't lose sight of who I am while being open to what I need to become to handle these challenges in front of me?
It's interesting you say that because I, as somebody who's a Gen Xer, like I look at the younger generations and sometimes I get a little frustrated because I feel like it's easier for them life, but then I forget that, the challenges just present themselves differently. And in a world now, as you kind of pointed out, where information is just a couple clicks and a enter button away, thanks to the internet and, now AI and machine learning. Um, but to the point where you're saying, well, the authentic, the realness, that
Mm-hmm.
real connection, that feeling that that organic, natural, that love, as you had mentioned, you can't replicate that
Mm-hmm.
with technology right now. Like, yeah, you could make great art and wonderful music but that real feeling that comes when there's that, that spiritual, soulful connection. And it's interesting when you think about that in like a religious or in like a spiritual context, is that
Yeah.
there are so many people who are literally just kind of walking around right now, confused, dazed, unsure of themselves. And to stumble across something like this in any way could be that little piece of light that they need to get out of that hole or tunnel that they keep wandering down.
I mean, it kind of goes back to things that are taught in the first degree about the idea of light and dark. And the thing I
Mm,
really like about that kind of dichotomy is it reminded me that it's not as much what matters is about good or bad or the light and dark in life. It's the fact that you learn from both. And that's been like one of the most important lessons I've learned, especially as a doctor, because I see incredibly good things, amazing things that surprise me. And then you'll see some really awful things. For instance, like seeing people in their 30s get diagnosed with a devastating disease and they have
mm,
all these responsibilities, and you're in that same age group and you can empathize with them because you know what it's like to be like, wow, I'm your same age, and yet our paths are two completely different journeys and you just got the rough end of the stick and there's no
mm.
rhyme or reason to it. It's not that this person was worse than me, nothing. It happened. And I think the more that you see all those things happen with people, it gives you this sense of humility to be appreciative for what you have and being able to participate where they're at, but then also realizing that there's a lot that you take for granted, that the important thing to do is to make sure you're not wasting the time that's given, because at the end of the day no one knows the time that they'll end, and the last thing you want to do is to not live authentically. And I think for Sufism, that's the thing it asks you, is you have to live authentically, because at the end of the day the only relationship that you can carry forward is the one that you can't touch, the one
Mm.
that you can't necessarily point to and say God's right there. You can't do that. So it asks you to really say, if everything was stripped away from you, what would actually be left? And that's a hard question for people to answer, where everything that people's identity is based on is all external. It's not really internal. People identify by their job, being married, family, relationships, everything else external. But then internal, it's like, well, how do you define yourself? Unfortunately, no one else can do that. You have to determine that with God, and that's the hard part because you can't get any external reward for that. No one's going to
Yeah.
know how much you've grown, and I think that's the hard part.
So, Brother Jonathan, I think we've done a fabulous job of kind of laying out what this is all about. And I'm sure there's our listeners saying, okay, I'm interested. You got me. Like, where would you recommend for someone? And I'm sure I pronounce
Yeah.
Sufism wrong every single time. I don't even have to look in the comments for this episode. I apologize in advance. I realize I pronounced it incorrectly. But instead of telling somebody, well, go read this book, maybe sometimes that is the option here.
Mhm.
What's a great way for someone to get into the baby steps of Sufism?
So I have a few good resources. I think instead of reading a book, because that is, like you said, the easiest thing, there's actually a good YouTube channel called Religion for Breakfast, and he actually has a philosophy. I think he's actually a professor in the philosophy of religion, or he's a student in it, and he has videos on different religious sects, and he does one just on Sufism. What's nice is that he does it on the belief system and the history. So he goes into like the misconceptions that he's like, people call Sufism the mysticism of Islam. He's like, well, wait a minute. Sufism is not always a non-violent faith. He's like, here's the history of how it's had its own interesting history. So I think there's a lot of good YouTube videos that can really give you a sense of the different cultural dimensions and the diversity in the Sufi tradition to start off with. The other thing that's really helpful is if you're going to read anything, just read the poetry of Rumi, read the poetry of Hafiz, all these different other Sufi poets, because they didn't just write a textbook saying, here is my spiritual philosophy of life. In fact, most of what they wrote was actually in poetry. So, and the good thing is that it's more open to interpretation. On the other hand, it's much more approachable because you don't need to read the entire Rumi poetry set to understand what he's talking about. And so I think you can pick and choose what resonates with you. And I think that's